I survived exactly 11 minutes at Ashworth Media before spilling a latte down the CEO's charcoal suit. Vivienne Ashworth fired me on the spot, but 3 days later she called me back, offering double the salary to be her private assistant. I thought I was walking back into a nightmare. Instead, I accidentally fell in love with her. But then, I found the secret file she'd been keeping on me, and everything I thought I knew shattered.
The elevator doors slid open on the 27th floor, and Grace Calloway's life as a New Yorker officially ended before her first cup of coffee had even gotten cold. She had rehearsed this morning 40 times. Exit the subway at 47th Street. Walk 2 blocks to the Ashworth Media Building. Take the elevator to the 27th floor. Smile at the receptionist. Say, "Grace Calloway, new assistant to Ms. Ashworth." The words had felt solid in her mouth, like something that belonged to a person who had their life together. Then, the elevator lurched. She stumbled forward, and the triple-shot oat milk latte she had bought as a celebratory treat launched itself out of her trembling hand like a liquid missile. It hit Vivienne Ashworth's charcoal gray suit jacket at precisely the angle of maximum damage. Grace registered the fabric darkening in slow motion. She registered the 2 security guards flanking the CEO, who had apparently been standing right inside the elevator, mid-conversation. She registered the silence that followed, which was the kind of silence that made other silences feel like loud parties. And she registered the woman herself, Vivienne Ashworth, turning to look at her with the calm, measured attention of someone who was deciding whether to step on a bug or simply have it removed. "Ms. Ashworth, I am so sorry. I did not mean to. The elevator just—" Grace's voice came out 2 octaves higher than normal. Vivienne Ashworth did not look at the stain. She did not look at the coffee puddles spreading across the marble floor. She looked directly at Grace, and her eyes were the color of a winter sky right before a storm, pale gray and utterly unreadable. "You're the new assistant," Vivienne said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. Grace Calloway. I just started
I was on my way up to. You're from Ohio?" Grace blinked. "Yes, Columbus, actually, but Vivienne's lips curved into something that was technically a smile, but had all the warmth of a frost warning. "And you thought you could walk into my building, spill coffee on me, and what, exactly? Distract me while your colleagues in Columbus uploaded the recording from your wire? Or were you planning something more traditional, like selling the board meeting minutes to the Post?" Grace's stomach dropped so fast she felt it in her knees. "Recording? No, I don't have any recording devices. I'm just an assistant. I graduated from Ohio State last May. I have a degree in journalism. I never—" "Journalism." Vivienne repeated the word like it was a species of vermin. "So you're not just incompetent, you're also ambitious. That's a dangerous combination, Miss Calloway." "I'm not—" Grace's voice cracked. She was aware that her face was burning, that the security guards were exchanging glances, that somewhere behind her she could hear the soft hum of the office coming to life. People emerging from cubicles to witness the spectacle of the new girl being publicly eviscerated on her first morning. "Security will escort you out," Vivienne said. "HR will process your termination paperwork. Consider this your first and final day at Ashworth Media. I wish I could say it's been a pleasure, but we both know it hasn't." She turned and walked down the corridor without looking back, the coffee stain darkening on the back of her jacket like a brand. Grace stood there, in the middle of the lobby, her hands still outstretched in the shape of a coffee cup that no longer existed, and felt the entire weight of the city pressing down on her shoulders. The security guard, a large man with kind eye,
Link, and a name tag that said Dale, touched her elbow gently. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get your things." Grace followed him in a daze. She had not even made it to her desk. She had not even met her colleagues. She had been employed at Ashworth Media for exactly 11 minutes, and she had already been fired for espionage she hadn't committed, incompetence she couldn't disprove, and a coffee-related accident that had destroyed the only real job offer she had received in 6 months of applying. She sat on the curb outside the building, her cardboard box of personal items on her lap, a framed photo of her mom, a notebook with a broken spiral, a granola bars she had packed for lunch, and watched the gray Manhattan skyline blur through unshed tears. She had come to New York with $1,200 in savings, a journalism degree, and a dream that had felt so solid in Ohio and so laughably fragile here. Her phone buzzed. A voicemail from her mom. She didn't answer it. She couldn't, not yet. 2 days passed. Grace spent them in her cramped studio apartment in Astoria, eating instant ramen and applying to every job posting she could find. her resume now carrying the scarlet letter of a one-day tenure at Ashworth Media. She had stopped crying by the second morning, mostly because crying used up energy she needed for the job search. But when her phone rang on the third day and the caller 499 flashed an unfamiliar Manhattan number, she almost didn't answer. She answered. "Miss Calloway." The voice was clipped, efficient, and unmistakably familiar. "This is Vivienne Ashworth." Grace's hand tightened around the phone. She considered hanging up. She considered throwing the phone across the room. She did neither. "Ms. Ashworth," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I assume this is about
Thing lawsuit you're planning to file. Because I can assure you I don't have the money, but I do have a witness who saw the elevator lurch, and—" "I reviewed the security footage," Vivienne interrupted, "and the background check your agency submitted, and your portfolio from Ohio State, the journalism pieces you wrote for the student paper, the internship at the Columbus Dispatch." Grace held her breath. "You were telling the truth," Vivienne said. "You weren't a spy. You were just clumsy and unlucky." "Thank you for that glowing character reference," Grace said, her voice thin. "I'll put it on my resume right under the part where you fired me for a crime I didn't commit." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Vivienne spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "The woman who was supposed to be my assistant before you. She was the one who leaked information to a competitor. I discovered it this morning. She's been terminated. I need a replacement I can trust." "I'm not sure that's me," Grace said. "I'm the woman who spilled coffee on your jacket." "You're also the woman who stood there and took it," Vivienne said. "You didn't cry. You didn't beg. You didn't try to blame the elevator or the guard or the coffee shop. You just stood there and took the hit and walked out with your head up." Grace didn't know what to say to that. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like shock. "I'm offering you the position," Vivienne said. "Private assistant to the CEO. Double the salary, your own office, and a coffee machine with a spill-proof lid." Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Is this a joke?" "I don't joke, Miss Calloway." There was the faintest hint of something in her voice, not quite warmth, but the shadow of it. "And I don't think second chances. This is the only one you're going to get." Grace looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly, and thought about the voicemail from her mom that she hadn't answered, and the $312 left in her bank account, and the dream that had brought her here, deflated and bruised but not yet dead. "When do I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Don't be late." Vivienne paused. "And Grace?" "Yes? Bring your own coffee. I don't trust you with mine yet." The line went dead. Grace sat, Dare phone in hand, staring at the ceiling of her tiny apartment, and felt something that might have been hope creeping back into her chest, tentative and fragile as the first crocus after a long winter. She was going to work for the woman who had fired her, the woman who looked at her like she was a bug, the woman whose gray eyes had held something for just a moment that Grace couldn't quite name. She just hoped she wouldn't spill anything this time. Grace arrived at Ashworth Media at 7:45 the next morning, which meant she had been standing outside the building for 25 minutes, clutching a paper cup of coffee from the bodega on the corner, trying to convince herself that walking through those revolving doors was a good idea. She had laid out her outfit the night before: a navy blazer, cream blouse, black trousers that she had ironed twice. She had practiced her smile in the mirror until it looked less like a grimace. She had even bought a new notebook, the kind with a faux leather cover that felt like something a professional person would carry. The notebook was now tucked under her arm, along with her old one from Ohio State, which she couldn't bear to leave behind even though its spiral was broken, and its pages were filled with notes from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection in the glass door. "You are a competent adult. You have a degree. You have professional references. You have—" She paused, looking down at the coffee cup in her hand. "You have spill-proof lids." The lobby was quieter than she remembered. The marble floors gleamed under the morning light, and the security guard at the desk, a different one this time, a young woman with short hair and a friendly smile, waved her through after checking her 499. The elevator ride to the 27th floor was mercifully uneventful. No lurching, no coffee, no CEO with unreadable gray eyes. The doors opened onto a wide corridor lined with glass-walled offices.
Grace stepped out, momentarily disoriented by the sheer scale of it all, the exposed brick walls, the industrial cute lighting, the rows of desks where people were already typing furiously at their computers. A woman with a sleek bob and hairset was pacing by the window, speaking rapid-fire into her microphone about something called the Q3 metrics. "Can I help you?" A man's voice, warm and unhurried, cut through her confusion. Grace turned to find a man in his mid-40s leaning against the doorframe of a nearby office. He was tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was holding a mug that said, "World's Okayest Assistant," and there was a small orange cat hair on his sleeve. "I'm Grace Calloway," she said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "I'm the new personal assistant to the Queen," he finished, grinning. "Yeah, I heard about you. I'm Marcus. I was supposed to be training you before you got, untrained." Grace winced. Word travels fast. "Honey, in this ice. Survival is an art form." Marcus pushed off the door frame and extended his hand. She shook it, grateful for the warmth of his grip. "Don't worry about the coffee thing. I once spilled a whole pot of espresso on her during a board meeting. She didn't fire me, but she did make me clean the conference room with a toothbrush." "There's no way that's true." "There is absolutely no way that's true," he admitted, grinning. "But it made you smile, didn't it?" Grace felt the corners of her mouth lift despite herself. Maybe a little. Marcus led her down the corridor, past the glass-walled offices and the rows of cubicles, pointing out various landmarks as they went. The break room with the notoriously broken coffee machine, it only works if you talk to it nicely. The conference room, where the Q3 metrics were being discussed, whatever those are. The copy room that everyone called the tragedy room because of the paper jam incident of 2019. "Your office is down here," Marcus said, stopping in front of a door at the end of the corridor. It was smaller than the other offices, but it had a window that looked out over the Manhattan skyline, and there was a brand-new coffee machine sitting on the desk, still in its box. Grace stared at it. "Is that—" "Spill-proof," Marcus confirmed. "She ordered it herself, special delivery, express shipping. I've been here 6 years and she's never bought me anything, so I'm taking this as a sign that you're either very special or very dangerous." "Or both," Grace said quietly. Marcus laughed. "I like you. You've got a sense of humor under all that Ohio earnestness. That's good. You'll need it." He showed her the filing system, the calendar app, the emergency protocols for everything from server outages to unexpected visits from the board chairman. Grace took notes in her new notebook, her pen moving fast across the pages, trying to absorb the sheer volume of information being thrown at her. At one point, Marcus paused mid-explanation about the color-coded folders and looked at her with a curious expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why did you come back?" "I mean, she fired you, publicly, in front of the whole lobby, and then she called you up and offered you the job, and you just came back. Why?" Grace considered the question. She thought about the $312 in her bank account. She thought about the voicemail from her mom that she still hadn't answered. She thought about the dream that had felt so solid in Ohio and so fragile here. "Because she asked me to," Grace said finally. "And because I don't like leaving things unfinished." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, like he was filing that information away for later. "Good answer. Most people would have told her to go to hell. You didn't. That's interesting." Before Grace could ask what he meant, a voice came over the office intercom, crisp and unmistakable. "Marcus, bring Miss Calloway to my office, now." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "The Queen summons. Let's go." Grace followed him back down the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had prepared for this moment. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would apologize again, how she would prove that she was more than just the woman who spilled coffee. But all of that preparation evaporated the moment Marcus pushed open the door to Vivienne Ashworth's office. The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, and the walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes and framed photographs of newsrooms and press conference. The desk was a massive slab of dark wood, and behind it sat Vivienne Ashworth, looking exactly as Grace remembered her, immaculate, composed, utterly in control. except for one small detail. There was a faint shadow under her eyes, barely visible beneath the careful makeup. And when she looked up at Grace, there was something in her gaze that hadn't been there before. Not warmth, exactly, but something softer, something almost like relief. "Miss Calloway," Vivienne said, setting down her pen. "I see you found your office." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the coffee machine." Vivienne's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. "I meant what I said about the spill-proof lid. I can't afford any more casualties." Grace felt herself relax. "Just a fraction. I'll do my best not to cause any." "I'm sure you will." Vivienne picked up a folder from her desk and handed it to Grace. "These are the files for next week's board meeting. I need you to review them, cross-reference the financial projections with the Q3 reports, and prepare a summary for me by Friday. Marcus can show you the system." Grace took the folder, her fingers brushing against Vivienne's for just a moment. The touch was brief, barely a second, but she felt it, a small spark of something, like static electricity on a dry day. Vivienne pulled her hand back quickly, her expression unreadable. "You can go now." "Thank you, Ms. Ashworth." Grace turned to leave, her heart still racing, her hands still tingling from the brief contact. She had made it through her first meeting without spilling anything, without saying anything stupid, without— "Miss Calloway," she stopped, turning back. Vivienne was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Bring your own coffee tomorrow," Vivienne said. "The mock in your office is for emergencies, but if you need anything at all, my door is open." It was the closest thing to an apology Grace had ever heard from her, and as she walked back down the corridor, clutching the folder to her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the Ice Queen than anyone knew. The boardroom smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. Grace stood against the wall behind Vivienne's chair, notebook in hand, trying to make herself as invisible as a 6-hour-old coffee stain on a white tablecloth. 7 executives sat around the mahogany table, their voices overlapping in the kind of corporate dance that felt more like a cage fight than a meeting. Grace had been working at Ashworth Media for exactly 6 days. 6 days of learning which elevator to take, which coffee order to memorize, which Marcus-approved phrases to use when Vivienne's mood turned from frosty to Arctic. 6 days of watching Vivienne Ashworth command a room like she was born with a gavel in her hand. Today, though, something was off. Vivienne's voice was steady, but her left hand kept drifting to her throat, touching the collar of her cream silk blouse. Her skin had taken on a faint reddish flush that Grace initially chalked up to the room's aggressive heating. But then Vivienne's breathing changed, a tiny hitch between words, and Grace noticed the way her nails pressed into the armrest of her chair. The CFO was droning on about quarterly projections. Grace glided around the room, cataloging the details the way her journalism professors had taught her. The CFO had a small vase of lilies near his notepad. The marketing director had a fresh bouquet of roses on the table beside her water glass. And the VP of operations had a green smoothie that Grace had seen him blend in the office kitchen that morning, complete with a generous scoop of almond butter. Grace's stomach tightened. She knew that combination. She had grown up watching her mother's face swell after a Sunday brunch gone wrong. She reached into her bag, fingers finding the small orange bottle without looking. She had carried it with her for years, ever since her mom's first severe reaction at a family reunion. Habit had kept it in her purse, in her backpack, in her coat pocket. It had never once occurred to her that she might need it for her boss. Vivienne's voice faltered mid-sentence. Her hand went to her collar again, tugging at it like it had suddenly become too tight. The CFO kept talking, oblivious. The marketing director was checking her phone under the table. Grace moved. She crossed the room in 4 quiet steps, set the small orange bottle on the table beside Vivienne's hand, and placed a packet of tissues next to it. She didn't say a word. She didn't lean in to explain. She simply stepped back to her spot against the wall and resumed taking notes. Vivienne's eyes flicked down, her fingers closed around the bottle. She read the label, then looked up at Grace with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between startled and something softer Grace didn't have a name for. The CFO was still talking. The meeting continued. 20 minutes later, the room emptied. Executives filed out with handshakes and empty promises. Grace lingered, collecting her notebook, pretending not to watch Vivienne out of the corner of her eye.
The flush on Vivienne's skin had faded. Her breathing had evened out. She was sitting very still, turning the orange bottle over in her hands. "This is antihistamine," Vivienne said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual command. "Generic, not prescription." Grace nodded. "It usually kicks in within 15 minutes. You should be past the worst of it now." Vivienne looked up at her. In the fluorescent light of the boardroom, with her carefully constructed armor momentarily set aside, she looked younger, tired, almost human. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Grace said. "I just noticed the lilies and the roses and the almond butter smoothie. You were touching your collar. You get a little rash on your neck when you're about to have a reaction." Vivienne's hand drifted to her collar again, then fell away. "Most people don't notice things like that." "I'm a journalist," Grace said, and then caught herself. I studied journalism. We're trained to notice details." "You're not a journalist anymore," Vivienne said. It wasn't cruel, it was just a fact, stated plainly, the way Vivienne stated all facts. "You're my assistant. You fetch coffee and schedule meetings and file expense reports." "Those things can also be done while noticing details," Grace said carefully. Something flickered in Vivienne's gray eyes. She set the orange bottle down on the table between them, pushed it gently toward Grace. "You should keep this. In case I have another reaction." "Or in case someone else does," Grace said, picking it up. She tucked it back into her bag next to her notebook and the granola bars she still hadn't eaten. Vivienne watched her for a long moment. "You didn't tell anyone what happened in there." "It wasn't my story to tell." "No," Vivienne agreed. "It wasn't." She stood, smoothing down her blouse, the armor sliding back into place so smoothly Grace almost missed the moment it happened. "Thank you, Miss Calloway." It was the first time Vivienne had ever said those two words to her. Grace felt them land somewhere in her chest, warm and unexpected, like the first sunbeam through a window after a storm. "You're welcome, Miss Ashworth." She turned to leave, but Vivienne's voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Calloway." Grace turned. Vivienne was standing by the boardroom table, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Manhattan skyline. The late afternoon light caught the edges of her dark hair, turning them gold. "It wasn't just that you noticed," Vivienne said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from her against her will. "It's that you didn't make it about yourself. You didn't announce it. You didn't expect anything in return." Grace considered this. "My mom used to say that kindness only counts if nobody's keeping score." Vivienne's expression shifted, something unreadable passing through her eyes. "Your mock sounds like a wise woman." "She is," Grace smiled, small and tentative. "She also has the same allergy. That's why I carry the pills." She left before Vivienne could respond, walking down the corridor with her heart pounding and her hands steady. She had told Vivienne a truth about herself, small and harmless, but it felt significant all the same. Like the first brick removed from a wall she hadn't even known she was building. Behind her, in the empty boardroom, Vivienne Ashworth stood very still for a long time, watching the door through which her new assistant had just disappeared. She had built her entire life on the principle that people were temporary, that trust was a liability, that the only person you could rely on was yourself. And yet here was this girl from Ohio, with her generic antihistamine and her unassuming kindness, quietly dismantling every wall Vivienne had ever constructed. Vivienne don't know whether to be grateful or terrified. She decided to be neither. She decided to be practical instead. She walked back to her office, sat down at her desk, and pulled up Grace Calloway's file on her computer. She read it again, more carefully this time, looking for the angle, the agenda, the hidden agenda that everyone had. She found nothing. Just a girl from Columbus with a journalism degree and a dream too big for her small-town roots. Just a girl who carried antihistamine for a mother she clearly loved. Just a girl who had stood up after being publicly humiliated and come back for more. Vivienne closed the file and stared at her reflection in the darkened window. Somewhere in the distance, the city was lighting up for the evening, a million tiny lights flickering to life against the deepening blue. She had hired Grace Calloway because she was desperate and the background check was clean. But looking at the empty bottle of antihistamine on her desk, the one Grace had left behind without a second thought, Vivienne realized she might have accidentally hired the one person in Manhattan who wasn't trying to get something from her. The thought was more unsettling than comforting, because if Grace wasn't trying to get something, then what was she doing here? What did she want? And why did Vivienne suddenly want to find out? The second week at Ashworth Media taught Grace two things. The first was that Vivienne Ashworth ran her empire on a schedule so precise it made Swiss trains look sloppy. The second was that the woman had an uncanny ability to appear in doorways without making a sound, like a very expensive ghost. Grace was learning to live with both realities. She had stopped flinching when Vivienne materialized beside her desk. She had learned to keep the CEO's inner on her phone, her laptop, and a paper backup in her bag. Because Vivienne had once asked her with genuine curiosity, "What happens if all three fail?" Grace had not had an answer, and the memory still made her cheeks warm. On Thursday morning, the chaos was running at a solid 8 out of 10. A network affiliate in Chicago had a technical meltdown during the morning broadcast. The head of legal was on vacation, which meant his deputy was panicking about everything, and Vivienne had a lunch meeting with the mayor, followed by a board prep session, followed by a flight to Boston that absolutely could not be missed. Grace was juggling 3 phone calls when Marcus appeared at her desk holding a garment bag. "Emergency delivery," he said, his voice pitched low like they were in a spy movie. She spilled coffee on her backup blouse. "Don't ask how. I've learned not to ask. And this is the replacement from the dry cleaner on 5th. She needs it in the next 5 minutes because the car is already waiting." Grace grabbed the bag and headed for Vivienne's office, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The door was ajar, and she pushed it open without thinking, the way she had been trained to do, because Vivienne hated closed doors when she was between meetings. She stopped in the doorway. Vivienne was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to the door, wearing a silk blouse that was definitely not the one she had started the day in. She was also, Grace realized with a start, struggling with her tie. It was a deep burgundy silk tie, the kind that looked expensive and probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent. And Vivienne was holding it wrong, looping it wrong, her fingers clumsy in a way that seemed completely at odds with the woman who could not negotiate a billion-dollar merger without breaking a sweat. "Oh, Ms. Ashworth, I have your blouse," Grace said, holding up the garment bag. Vivienne turned, and for a split second Grace saw something flicker across her face. Embarrassment. It was gone so fast Grace almost thought she had imagined it, replaced by the familiar cool mask. "Thank you." Set it on the chair. Vivienne turned back to the window, her fingers still fumbling with the tie. "And tell Marcus I'll be down in 4 minutes. Grace set down the garment bag. She should have left. She had other things to do, calls to make, schedules to confirm, but she found herself not leaving, her feet rooted to the carpet as she watched the CEO of a media empire lose a battle with a piece of fabric. "Ms. Ashworth," she heard herself say, "your tie is inside out." Vivienne's hands stilled. She turned, one eyebrow raised. "Excuse me?" "The tie. You're holding it wrong. The seam should be facing the collar, not—" Grace stepped forward before she could stop herself, her body moving on autopilot, the way it did when her mother's hands trembled too much to button her own coat. "May I?" Vivienne looked at her for a long moment, her gray eyes unreadable. Then slowly, she lowered her hands. Grace stepped closer. The proximity was sudden and electric, the way it always was when you crossed a boundary you hadn't realized was there. She could smell Vivienne's perfume now, jasmine and something warmer underneath, like sandalwood. She could see the faint lines at the corners of Vivienne's eyes, the slight shadows beneath them that spoke of another sleepless night. "Your hands are shaking," Vivienne said quietly. Grace looked down. She hadn't noticed. "I get nervous," she admitted. "It's a character flaw. It's a human one." Grace's fingers worked the tie, loosening the twisted knot, flipping it right side out, starting over. She was acutely aware of everything, the warmth radiating from Vivienne's body, the way the silk slid against her palms, the fact that Vivienne was holding perfectly still, barely breathing like a deer that had decided not to run. She looped the tie around Vivienne's neck, folded the collar down, and began to tie the knot. She had done this for her father 100 times before he left, before the bankruptcy, before everything fell apart. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of disuse. "You're good at this," Vivienne said. Her voice was lower than usual, almost thoughtful. "My dad taught me. He wore a tie every day to work." Grace tightened the knot, smoothed the fabric, and stepped back. "There, You're presentable." She looked up and found Vivienne watching her with an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't the usual cool assessment. It was something softer, more uncertain, like a question that hadn't quite formed yet. "Thank you," Vivienne said. Her voice was quiet. "Don't mention it. I'm sure you'll find a way to fire me for it." Grace said it lightly, a joke, a way to break the tension that had settled over the room like a held breath. Vivienne's lips curved, just slightly, the closest thing to a genuine smile Grace had seen on her face. "I don't think I will." The moment stretched. Grace's heart was doing something complicated in her chest, something she didn't have a name for and didn't want to examine too closely. "Your car's waiting," she said finally. Vivienne nodded, grabbed her blazer, and walked past Grace toward the door. She paused in the doorway. "Grace." "Yes?" "You're not fired. And I don't say that to many people." She was gone before Grace could respond. The door swinging shut behind her. Grace stood in the empty office, surrounded by the faint scent of jasmine and sandalwood, her fingers still tingling from the feel of silk and the warmth of another person's skin. She had tied 100 ties in her lifetime. She had never felt anything like that. She walked back to her desk in a daze, and Marcus was waiting for her, leaning against the wall with a knowing look on his face. "Interesting," he said. "What?" "That took you 4 minutes. That's a 2-minute tie at most." Marcus grinned, his eyes crinkling. "Honey, in this office, attention to detail is a survival skill, and you just spent 4 minutes paying very close attention to the most powerful woman in New York." Grace felt her cheeks heat. "I was fixing her tie. It was inside out." "Uh-huh." Marcus pushed off the wall, patting her shoulder as he passed. "You keep telling yourself that, sweetheart. Just remember, I've worked for her for 7 years. I've seen her take down senators. I've seen her fire people for looking at her wrong. And I've never, not once, seen her let anyone touch her tie." He walked off, whistling, leaving Grace standing at her desk with her heart pounding and her mind spinning. She looked down at her hands. They were still shaking. The first time Grace stayed past midnight at Ashworth Media, it wasn't because she had too much work. It was because she had too much to avoid at home. Her apartment in Astoria had developed a leak in the ceiling. The landlord had stopped answering her calls, and the only sound in the place was the drip, drip, drip of cold water hitting a plastic bucket she'd positioned under the stain. The sound reminded her of a metronome, ticking away the hours of a life that wasn't quite going anywhere. So, when Marcus had mentioned at 6 p.m. that she could use the office library to finish organizing the quarterly reports, she'd said yes without hesitation. She hadn't expected to still be there at 2:47 a.m. The reports were done. The library was silent. The view of the Manhattan skyline from the 27th floor was glittering and indifferent. Grace stretched her neck, collected her things, and was about to head to the elevator when she noticed the light coming from under the door of the corner office. Vivienne's office. She knows of Vivienne's because she had memorized the layout of this floor in her first week, and because no one else on the executive level worked this late except the CEO herself. But at nearly 3 a.m, Grace expected the hallway to be empty. The lights dimmed, the building locked down for the night. Instead, there was a thin strip of warm light escaping from beneath the door, and the faint sound of something familiar. A movie. An old one, with the scratchy quality of a film reel that had been played 100 times. Grace hesitated. She knew she should walk away. She knew that whatever was happening behind that door was none of her business, that Vivienne Ashworth had made it abundantly clear that her personal life was a locked vault with no key. But something in the sound of that old movie, playing alone in the dark of the night, made her feet stop moving. She walked to the door and knocked softly. No answer. She knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. She pushed the door open a fraction of an inch, just enough to see inside, and her breath caught in her throat. Vivienne Ashworth, the Ice Queen of Ashworth Media, was sitting on the leather sofa in her office, barefoot, wearing a gray cashmere sweater that looked too soft for someone Sophie's event. Harp. She was curled up against the armrest, a glass of scotch on the table beside her, untouched. Her hair was loose, falling across her shoulders in dark waves that Grace had never seen before. Vivienne always wore it pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. And on the enormous wall screen across from her, the classic film played on mute, the black and white images flickering across her face. Humphrey Bogart was saying something to Ingrid Bergman. Vivienne was staring at the screen with the look of someone who had watched this movie so many times that the dialogue was no longer necessary. Grace knew the movie. Her father had watched it every Christmas without fail, a glass of bourbon in his hand and a faraway look in his eyes. "Play it again, Sam," he would whisper along with the film. And Grace, young and bored, had never understood why that line made him sad. She understood now. She stood in the doorway, frozen, watching Vivienne Ashworth watch Casablanca in the dark. The woman who fired her on her first day. The woman who had rehired her with a whispered confession about trust. The woman who had let her fix her tie and had almost smiled. The woman who was, at 3 a.m, utterly and completely alone. Grace stepped back, her heart hammering. She moved quietly down the hall to the small kitchenette on the executive floor, where she knew there was a mini-fridge stocked with milk and a box of herbal tea that no one ever touched. She heated the milk in the microwave, careful not to let it boil, and poured it into a clean ceramic mug she had found in a cabinet. She walked back to Vivienne's office. The door was still ajar. The movie was still playing. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, crossed the room in 4 silent steps, and placed the think on the table next to the untouched scotch. Then she turned and left without a word. She was halfway down the hall when she heard the voice behind her. "Grace." She stopped, turned. Vivienne was standing in the doorway of her office, the light from inside framing her silhouette, the mug of warm milk in her hands. Her face was unreadable, but there was something in the way she held the mug, both hands wrapped around it like she was cold, that made Grace's chest ache. "How did you know?" Vivienne asked. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual authority. "How did you know I couldn't sleep?" Grace shook her head. "I didn't. I just thought, if I was going to be awake at 3 a.m, I'd probably want something warm." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. Vivienne stared at her for a long moment. The city hummed below them, indifferent and alive. The old movie flickered behind her, lighting up the edges of her face in silver and shadow. "Thank you," Vivienne said. The words sounded foreign in her mouth, like she was speaking a language she didn't quite know. "You're welcome," Grace said. And then, because she didn't know what else to do, she added, "I'll see you in the morning, Ms. Ashworth." She turned and walked away. She was at the elevator, pressing the button, when she heard the door to Vivienne's office close, soft and final, behind her. The elevator doors slid open. Grace stepped inside, and only then, when she was alone in the silent metal box descending through the dark heart of the building, did she let herself feel the full weight of what she had just witnessed. Vivienne Ashworth was lonely. Not the kind of lonely that came from being alone. The kind of lonely that came from being surrounded by hundreds of people and still believing that next thing one would ever really see her. The kind of lonely that watched Casablanca on mute at 3 a.m. because the sound of her own thoughts was too loud. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the elevator wall and closed her eyes. She was in trouble. Deep, complicated, heart-pounding trouble. Because she wanted to be the person who saw Vivienne Ashworth. She wanted to be the one who brought warm milk at 3 a.m. She wanted to be the reason that look in Vivienne's eyes, the one that said, "I'm not used to kindness," became a thing of the past. And she had absolutely no idea how to stop wanting that. The morning after the milk, Grace expected something to have shifted. She expected Vivienne to look at her differently, to acknowledge the strange intimacy of 3 a.m. with perhaps a nod or a word or even just a flicker of that vulnerability she had shown in the dim light of her office. Vivienne looked at her exactly the way she looked at the quarterly earnings report, efficiently, neutrally, as if Grace were a spreadsheet that had been correctly formatted. "Miss Calloway, the board meeting is at 10. I need the Q3 media consumption data compiled by 9:30. Marcus will brief you on the format." Grace stood in the doorway of Vivienne's office, holding a stack of files that suddenly felt very heavy. "Of course, Ms. Ashworth. Is there anything else?" "That will be all."
The dismissal was clean, professional, and utterly devoid of the woman who had stood in the hallway last night, her voice raw with a gratitude she clearly didn't know how to express. Grace told herself this was fine, this was normal, this was what a professional relationship looked like. She had not expected Vivienne to suddenly become warm and fuzzy. That wasn't who Vivienne busted, but she had expected something. She just didn't know what. The boardroom was on the 31st floor, all glass and chrome and the kind of minimalist decor that cost more than Grace's entire annual rent. 12 chairs surrounded a long oak table, each one occupied by a person who had more money in their left shoe than Grace would make in a decade. At the head of the table sat Vivienne, immaculate in a navy blue power suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look even more intimidating than usual. Grace stood against the wall as instructed, ready to take notes and fetch documents. She had been told to be seen and not heard. She had been told that board members did not like new faces asking questions. She had been told, in Marcus's words, to smile politely and pray you don't get asked anything. For the first 40 minutes, the meeting was boring in the way that only high-stakes corporate finance could be revenue projections, market share analysis, a discussion about the upcoming merger with a digital streaming platform that made Grace's eyes glaze over. Then Harold Whitmore, a silver-haired man with the permanent expression of someone who had just bitten into a lemon, cleared his throat. "Vivienne, I'd like to address the elephant in the room." Vivienne's smile was razor-thin. "I wasn't aware there was an elephant, Harold. Perhaps you could point it out. The Post ran a piece this morning, Ashworth Media CEO's cold management style causing talent drain. They've got quotes from 3 former executives who left last year. All of them describe you as, and I quote, a leader who treats people like disposable assets." Grace felt her stomach clench. She had seen the article on her phone during her commute. She had wanted to throw her phone into the
Hudson River. Vivienne's expression did not change. "I'm aware of the article. I'm also aware that those 3 executives were asked to leave after failing to meet their performance targets for 2 consecutive quarters. The Post chose to omit that context." "Be that as it may," Harold continued, leaning forward, "the board is concerned. Your management style has been a topic of discussion for some time now. The shareholders are nervous, and nervous shareholders tend to sell. I don't manage for shareholder comfort, Harold. I manage for results, and the results speak for themselves." "Results, yes. And yet, you've gone through 4 personal assistants in the past 2 years. 4, Vivienne. That's not a management style. That's a pattern." Grace's hands tightened around her notepad. She could feel her jaw clenching. She knew she was supposed to stay silent. She knew she was supposed to be seen and not heard. She knew that speaking up would be a violation of every professional norm she had been taught. But she also knew the truth. She knew the woman who watched Casablanca at 3 amperes. She knew the woman who had said thank you like it was a foreign language. She knew the woman who was not cold, but simply terrified of being seen as anything other than strong. "That's not fair." The words came out of Grace's mouth before her brain could stop them. "Ms. Ashworth's management style is demanding. Yes, but she's also fair. The people who left, they didn't leave because she was cold. They left because they couldn't handle the standards. There's a difference." The room went silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to Grace. She felt her face burning, but she didn't look away from Harold. Harold raised an eyebrow. "And you would know this?" "How, exactly?" "I work for her. I see how she operates. She expects excellence, but she doesn't ask anyone to do anything she wouldn't do herself. She's here before anyone else. She stays later than anyone else. Miss Calloway," Vivienne's voice cut through the room like a blade. "That's enough." Grace turned to look at her. Vivienne's face was pale, her eyes hard, but there was something else there, something that looked almost like fear. "I'm sorry, Miss Ashworth, I just thought—" "You thought wrong?" Vivienne's voice was ice. "You're an assistant. Your job is to take notes and fetch coffee, not to offer unsolicited commentary on matters you don't understand. If I wanted input from entry-level staff, I would have asked for it." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She felt them land somewhere in her chest, sharp and precise, exactly where she had felt that fragile warmth the night before. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I overstepped. Yes, Vivienne said, her voice cold. You did. I'll speak with you about this privately. For now, return to your position and refrain from speaking unless directly addressed. Grace nodded and stepped back against the wall. She kept her eyes on the floor, refusing to look at anyone, especially Vivienne. She could feel tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of the people who had just watched Vivienne cut her down. The meeting continued. Harold moved on to other topics. Grace took notes on autopilot, her handwriting shaky, her mind replaying the moment over and over. She had defended Vivienne because she believed in her, because she had seen a side of her that no one else in that room had seen, because she had thought, foolishly, that maybe it meant something. But to Vivienne, she was just an assistant, someone to be corrected publicly when she stepped out of line, someone whose defense was unwelcome and unwanted. When the meeting finally ended, Grace gathered her files and moved toward the door, keeping her head down. She heard footsteps behind her and felt a hand on her elbow. Grace. Vivienne's voice was low, almost urgent. Wait. Grace turned. Vivienne's face was unreadable again, but her grip on Grace's elbow was tight, almost desperate. I didn't mean, Vivienne started. Then she stopped. She looked away, her jaw tight. I'll have Marcus send you the revised meeting notes. You can take the rest of the afternoon off. I don't need the rest of the afternoon off, Grace said quietly. I need to do my job. Grace, I said I'm fine, Ms. Ashworth. Grace pulled her elbow free gently. It's fine, I'll figure it out. She walked out of the boardroom before Vivienne could say anything else. She made it to the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sob that was building in her chest. She had been fired on her first day and had survived. She had been rehired by the same woman and had thrived. She had spent 3 weeks watching Vivienne Ashworth with a growing sense of wonder and tenderness, but she had never been publicly humiliated. She had never been reminded so brutally that she was just the assistant, the hired help, the person who fetched coffee and took notes and knew her place. And the worst part was, she couldn't even be angry, because she had seen the look in Vivienne's eyes when she had told her to stop. It wasn't cruelty, it was fear. But Grace didn't know what Vivienne was afraid of, and right now she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. The boardroom fallout echoed through the rest of the day like a stone dropped into still water. Grace kept her head down, her notebook open, her pen moving across the page in a blur of shorthand she didn't actually need, because she wasn't taking notes about anything important. She was taking notes to keep her hands busy, to keep herself from looking up, from catching another glimpse of the woman who had cut her open in front of 12 men in expensive suits. She did not cry again. She had used up her tears in the bathroom stall, and what was left in her chest was something harder and duller, a bruised kind of determination that felt almost like pride. She had not quit. She had not run. She had stayed at her desk, answered the phones, rescheduled 2 meetings, and confirmed Vivienne's dinner reservation at the Italian place on Madison that she always ordered the same thing from, the one with the truffle pasta and the wine list she never actually looked at. It was almost 8 in the evening when the office finally emptied around her. Marcus paused at her desk on his way out, his overcoat draped over one arm, his orange cat screensaver glowing on his phone as he checked the time. "You're still here?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I have a few more things to finish," Grace said, which was a lie. She had finished everything. She was just not ready to leave yet. Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled the chair from the empty desk beside her and sat down, uninvited the way he did everything. "Honey, in this office, survival is an art form. And you, my dear, just painted yourself into a corner and then stood there smiling while the paint dried." Grace's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You stood up for her in there, in front of the whole board, and she bit your head off like you were a stray dog that wandered into her kitchen." "She was under a lot of pressure." "She's always under a lot of pressure," Marcus said. "That's the job description. The question is why you're still here at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, finishing work that was already done, when you could be at home with a glass of wine and a movie that didn't require you to watch your boss tear you apart in front of the people who sign her checks." Grace didn't answer. She couldn't, because she didn't have a good answer. She had been asking herself the same question all afternoon, and the only answer she could find was one she wasn't ready to say out loud. because she had seen the fear in Vivienne's eyes, because she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman who had fired her, rehired her, and then publicly humiliated her was, in some strange and broken way, trying to protect her, because she had spent 3 weeks watching Vivienne Ashworth, and she had started to see the cracks in the ice. "Just go home, Marcus," Grace said softly. "I'll lock up." Marcus stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a granola bars, identical to the one she had packed on her first day. He tossed it onto her desk. "For survival," he said. "You're going to need it." He walked toward the elevator, then paused and turned back. "She's still in her office, you know. She's been in there since the board meeting ended. No one's gone in. No one's come out. Whatever's happening in there, it's happening alone." The elevator door slid shut behind him, and Grace was left alone in the dim, humming quiet of the 27th floor. She sat there for a long time, staring at the granola bars on her desk, listening to the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. The clock on her computer screen ticked past 8. Past 8:30, past 9, she should go home. She should take the N train back to Astoria, heat up a frozen dinner, watch a show on her laptop, and pretend that this day had not happened. Instead, she stood up, walked to the small kitchenette that served the executive floor, and made a cup of tea, not for herself, for the woman who had been locked in her office for 5 hours. She carried it down the corridor, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet, and stopped in front of the heavy oak door with the brass nameplate that read Vivienne Ashworth, CEO. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it. She stood there, frozen, the heat of the mug seeping into her palms. Through the door she heard a voice, not Vivienne's, Marcus's. It took her a second to realize it was a memory, the words from earlier that evening replaying in her head. And then, beneath it, another voice, Grace's own. "She's under a lot of pressure. She's always under a lot of pressure. That's the job description." No, wait, that was Marcus. Grace pressed her ear closer to the door, her heart hammering. She could hear a faint voice from inside the office, and it took her a moment to realize it was Vivienne's, low and rough, speaking to someone on the phone. "Yes, I know what the article said. I know what Harold thinks. But I am not going to let this board turn into a circus because one journalist decided to write a hit piece about my management style." A pause. "No, I don't need a crisis PR team. I need to do my job. I need to fix the numbers, calm the investors, and remind everyone that this company didn't become what it is by accident." Another pause, longer this time. "And for the record, the assistant wasn't out of line." She waited, think defending me. I was the one who... The voice cut off, as if Vivienne had realized how much she was revealing. Grace stepped back from the door, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard enough. She had heard more than enough. She set the mug of tea on the small table beside the door, where Vivienne would see it when she came out. Then she turned and walked back to her desk, sat down, and opened her laptop. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she wasn't going to leave. Not yet. At 11:45, the door to Vivienne's office finally opened. Grace had fallen into a half-doze in her chair, her head resting on her folded arms. The sound of the door made her jerk upright, blinking. Vivienne stood in the doorway, her jacket gone, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair escaping its usually perfect knot in soft, dark strands. She looked exhausted. She looked human. She also looked startled when she saw Grace still sitting at her desk. "What are you still doing here?" Vivienne's voice was rough. Grace stood, her legs stiff from sitting too long. "I had some things to finish. It's almost midnight." "I know." Vivienne's gaze dropped to the table beside her door, where the mug of tea had long since gone cold. She picked it up, her fingers closing around the ceramic, and looked at it for a long moment. "This is for me," she said. It wasn't a question. "You didn't have dinner," Grace said. "You didn't have anything since the board meeting. I thought you might need something warm." Vivienne stared at her over the rim of the cold mug. Her gray eyes were unreadable, but something shifted in them, something that looked almost like pain. "You should have left hours ago," Vivienne said quietly. "I know." "Why didn't you?" Grace met her gaze. She thought about think in Vivienne's eyes, during the board meeting, the fear she had glimpsed beneath the ice. She thought about the phone call she had overheard,
The words Vivienne had started to say before she stopped herself. "Because you were still here," Grace said simply. The silence between them stretched, fragile and taut. Vivienne's hand tightened around the mug. She opened her mouth, closed it, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do with you, Grace." "That's okay," Grace said. "I don't know what to do with me either." For a moment, something flickered in Vivienne's eyes, something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Then she turned, walked back into her office, and closed the door behind her. But she left the tea on the table just outside. The mug, still warm from Grace's hands, sat on the table like a small, quiet promise. Grace gathered her things, turned off her desk lamp, and walked to the elevator. As she pressed the button, she heard a soft click behind her. She turned. Vivienne's door was open a crack, just enough for her to see the shape of her silhouette in the dim light of her office. "Good night, Grace," Vivienne said softly. "Good night, Miss Ashworth." The elevator doors slid shut, and Grace leaned against the back wall, her heart pounding, a slow, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. She didn't know what had just changed between them, but something had. Something had shifted in the hallway, in the dark, in the quiet. And she was pretty sure it wasn't just the cold tea. 3 nights later, Grace was still in the office at 9 o'clock, reorganizing Vivienne's travel schedule for the 3rd time because the CEO kept adding meetings that didn't exist yet. She didn't mind. The routine had become a kind of rhythm, a way of being near Vivienne without having to explain why she wanted to be near her. The boardroom confrontation had settled into an unspoken truce between them, not quite friendship, not quite employer-employee, something in the in-between that Grace was learning to navigate by instinct. She was about to pack up for the night when Vivienne's door opened. "Grace!" It wasn't a question. It was an invitation. Or something close to it, delivered in a voice that was softer than usual, stripped of its daytime armor. Grace looked up. Vivienne was standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light of her office, her hair loose around her shoulders, her jacket discarded somewhere. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Come in," Vivienne said. "Please?" Grace followed her into the office, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. The office was different at night. The floor-to-ceiling windows turned into a wall of city lights, the skyline glittering like 1,000 small promises. The bottle of scotch on the side table was untouched. Instead, on Vivienne's desk, there was a framed photograph that Grace had never noticed before, a woman with dark hair holding a small girl on her lap. The girl was maybe 6, laughing, her face half buried in the woman's neck. "My mother," Vivienne said, following Grace's gaze. Before she left, Grace didn't move. She didn't speak. She just waited, the way you wait for someone to open a door they've been holding shut for years. Vivienne sat down the edge of her desk, her hands folded in her lap. She looked impossibly small in the vastness of the room, this woman who commanded boardrooms and newsrooms and the attention of everyone she met. "She left when I was 12, Vivienne said quietly. "Ran off without a business partner. Left my father and me without a note. Just gone. I found out from a neighbor who saw them at the airport." She paused, her jaw tightening. "I was the one who had to tell my father. He couldn't stop crying. I was 12 and I had to be the strong one." Grace felt her throat close up. She wanted to reach out, to touch Vivienne's hand, but she didn't. She just listened. "After that, I learned that trust is a liability," Vivienne continued. "Every person who gets close to you has the power to leave, to betray, to take everything you've built and walk away without looking back." She looked up at Grace, her gray eyes unreadable in the dim light. "I've spent 20 years making sure no one gets close enough to do that to me again." Grace wanted to say something, but the words felt too small. So she did the only thing she could think of. She told the truth about herself. "My dad lost his business when I was 17, she said quietly. "He'd borrowed money from people who weren't patient. We lost the house, the car, everything. I had a scholarship to Ohio State, but I almost didn't take it because I couldn't leave my mom to deal with it alone." She paused, her voice steady. "She made me go, said the only way out was through. So I went, and I worked 3 jobs, and I got my degree, and I thought if I just worked hard enough, I could build something that couldn't be taken away." Vivienne watched her, something shifting in her expression. "But you couldn't?" "No," Grace said. I couldn't. The journalism job I wanted in New York, the one that would have been my big break, got cut in a round of layoffs before I even started. I spent 6 months applying for anything that would take me, and then you hired me, fired me, and rehired me in the span of 3 days.
She let out a small, humorless laugh. Turns out the only thing I'm consistent at is getting my heart broken by things that were never mine. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Grace had intended. Vivienne was silent for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "You don't give up." "No," Grace said, "I don't." "That's the thing I noticed about you," Vivienne said. "The first day when I fired you, you didn't beg, you didn't cry, you just stood there and took it. And when I called you back, you didn't say no, you didn't hold it against me. You just showed up the next morning, ready to try again." She paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've never met anyone like that, Grace." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Maybe you've never let anyone get close enough to try." Vivienne looked at her for a long, breathless moment. The city lights flickered behind her, casting shadows across her face. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, her voice barely audible, "Maybe I didn't." Neither of them moved. The space between them felt charged, electric, like the air before a storm. "I should go," Grace said finally, her voice not quite steady. "It's late." Vivienne nodded, but she didn't look away. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Ms. Ashworth." Grace walked to the door, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She paused at the threshold, her hand on the Freyan, and turned back. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I'm not going anywhere." Vivienne didn't answer, but Grace saw something flicker in her eyes, something that looked like hope and fear tangled together, and she carried that look with her all the way down to the subway. She still didn't know what she was doing, but she knew one thing. For certain now, Vivienne Ashworth, the ice queen of Manhattan media, was afraid. Not of the boardroom, not of her enemies, not of losing her empire. She was afraid of being seen. And Grace had seen her. Neither of them slept well that night. Grace found the file on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the night in Vivienne's office. She had been looking for the Q3 earnings report in Marcus's desk because Marcus was on vacation in Cabo and had left his filing system in a state that could only be described as a crime scene. The drawer was jammed, so she pulled harder, and the whole thing came out in her hands, spilling papers across the carpet. That was when she saw her own name. Grace Calloway, full background investigation. The folder was thick, thicker than any standard HR check had any right to be. She opened it with hands that had gone suddenly cold and found herself staring at a detailed chronology of her entire life. Her childhood address in Columbus, her father's bankruptcy filings, her mother's medical history, her college transcripts, her student loan balances, her internship evaluations from the Columbus Dispatch. A note in Vivienne's own handwriting, clipped to the final page, confirmed. No connection to Harrison or any competitor. Trust risk assessment. Moderate. Monitor. Grace read that sentence 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, because she was having trouble understanding the words. Monitor. Vivienne had investigated her, not just the standard background check that HR ran for every employee, a full, private, deeply personal investigation into every corner of her life conducted and reviewed by Vivienne herself. And she had filed it under a trust risk assessment with a rating of moderate. The coffee cup in Grace's other hand crumpled. She didn't notice. She stood there in Marcus's office, surrounded by the debris of his disorganized filing system, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. 3 weeks ago, Vivienne had told her about her mother. 3 weeks ago, Grace had told her about her father. 3 weeks ago, they had sat in the dark together and shared the wounds that neither of them had ever shown anyone else. And all that time, Vivienne had been reading a file that said, Trust, Risk, Assessment, Moderate. Grace walked out of Marcus's office without the earnings report. She walked down the hall to her own office, closed the door, and sat down at her desk. She stared at the wall for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and typed a single line into an email draft. I need to speak with you. Privately. She sent it to Vivienne's personal address. The response came back in less than a minute. My office, 6 o'clock.
Grace spent the rest of the afternoon in a fog. She answered emails, she scheduled meetings, she refilled the coffee machine with the spill-proof flib that Vivienne had bought her, a joke that had become a ritual. She did all of it on autopilot while her mind replayed the words from that folder over and over like a broken record. 6 o'clock came. Grace knocked on Vivienne's door. "Come in." Vivienne was at her desk, reading something, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when Grace entered, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She had always been able to read Grace, even when Grace didn't want to be read. "You found something," Vivienne said. Not a question. Grace closed the door behind her. She walked to the chair across from Vivienne's desk, but she didn't sit down. She placed the folder on the desk, face up, and watched Vivienne's eyes land on it. Vivienne
Think's face went still. Completely, unnaturally still. "I found this," Grace said, her voice remarkably calm. "In Marcus's drawer. It fell out when I was looking for the earnings report. I wasn't snooping, but I read it." Vivienne didn't reach for the folder. She didn't deny it. She just sat there, her hands folded on the desk, her eyes fixed on Grace's face. "Trust risk assessment," Grace said. "Moderate, monitor. You've been watching me this whole time. Since before you rehired me, and you never told me." "It was standard protocol," Vivienne said. Her voice was quiet, flat. "I don't hire anyone without a full investigation. You weren't special. You were just... Don't." Grace's voice cracked, and she felt the heat behind her eyes. "Don't tell me I wasn't special. Not after the night you told me about your mother. Not after I told you about my father. Not after you said you'd never let anyone close, and I told you I wasn't going anywhere. You let me hold your hand in the dark, Vivienne, and the whole time you had a folder that said Trust Risk Assessment, Moderate." Vivienne's jaw tightened. "The folder is old. It was written before I knew you, before..." "Before what?" Grace asked. "Before you decided I was worth trusting. Before you decided I wasn't going to leave like your mother did. You've been testing me for months, haven't you? Every little thing. The coffee, the tie, the milk at 3 a.m. You were collecting data, building a case, and you never once stopped to think about how it would feel to be the one being investigated." Vivienne stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor, and for a moment she looked like she might shout, but instead she walked around her desk, stopped in front of Grace, and looked down at her with those gray eyes which were suddenly very bright. "You want to know why I investigated you?" Vivienne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I don't trust people. I haven't trusted anyone since I was 12 years old, when my mother walked out the door and left me with a note that said she was sorry but she couldn't be a mother anymore. Do you know what that does to a child? It teaches them that everyone leaves, that everyone lies, that the people who say they love you are the same people who will destroy you." Grace opened her mouth, but Vivienne kept going, the words spilling out like a dam finally breaking. "So I built a wall. I built a career. I built an empire, and I told myself I didn't need anyone, because needing someone meant giving them the power to leave. Then you walked into my elevator with your coffee and your clumsy hands and your ridiculous optimism, and you spilled coffee on my jacket, and instead of crying or begging or blaming anyone else, you just stood there and took it. And I thought, this one is different. So I investigated you. I read every document about your life that I could find. And the more I read, the more I wanted to know. Because you were the first person in 20 years who made me want to trust someone again." Grace's hands were shaking. "You could have told me. You could have..." "I know." Vivienne's voice cracked. "I know I should have told you, but I was afraid. I was so afraid that if I told you how much you mattered to me, you would see how weak I am, and you would leave like everyone else." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She held it out to Grace with a hand that was trembling. "Read it," Vivienne said. "I was going to show you. I was going to wait until I had the courage, but you deserve to see it now." Grace took the paper. It leaved as a legal document. She scanned it, her eyes widening as she read the words. "Last will and testament of Vivienne Ashworth. Beneficiary, Grace Calloway." Grace looked up,
her vision blurring. You're in my will, Vivienne said. You've been in my will for 2 weeks. I changed it the day after you told me you weren't going anywhere. Because I finally understood something about myself that I had been running from for 20 years. She took a sip closer. Grace could smell the faint jasmine perfume, the same scent she had noticed on the day of the tie. I love you, Vivienne said. I don't know how to love anyone. I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I love you, and I'm terrified. I'm terrified that I've already ruined it by keeping secrets. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life watching you from behind a wall and never telling you the truth. Grace stood there, holding the will, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked at Vivienne, at the woman who had fired her, rehired her, investigated her, and loved her. All in the span of a few months. At the woman who was standing in front of her, shaking, with tears in her eyes, having just done the bravest thing Grace had ever seen anyone do. She set the will down on the desk. She stepped forward and she took Vivienne's hand. I'm not leaving, Grace said. I told you that. I meant it. The file, the investigation, the trust risk assessment. It hurt, Vivienne. It hurt more than you know, but I understand why you did it. And I'm still here. Vivienne let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her chest for years. She looked down at their joined hands, and a single tear slid down her cheek. I don't deserve you, she whispered. Maybe not yet, Grace said, soft to my lips like.
Phew! But you're going to spend the rest of your life trying, and that's good enough for me. 3 weeks after the night in Vivienne's office, Grace took the N train to Brooklyn on a Saturday morning. She had been thinking about the typewriter for a while now, not obsessively, not in a way that kept her up at night, but in the way certain thoughts settle into the back of your mind and wait, patient as cats, for you to finally pay attention to them. Vivienne had mentioned it once, weeks ago, during a late-night conversation about nothing in particular. She had said, almost offhandedly, that her mother used to type her letters on an old Remington, and that the sound of the keys had been the soundtrack of her childhood, a rhythm she had loved before she learned to hate the hands that wrote the words. Grace had filed that away the way she filed away everything Vivienne said. Carefully, completely, without making a show of it. The Brooklyn flea was crowded for a Saturday, but Grace moved through it with a purpose that surprised even her. She had never been good at finding things on purpose. She was a person who stumbled into things, who let the universe deliver her to the right place at the right time, and then tried not to trip over her own feet. But today, she was looking for something specific. She had a picture in her head, an old Remington, the kind with round keys and a carriage that dinged when you reached the end of a line, and she moved through the stalls like a woman on a mission. She found it at the third row, at a booth run by an elderly man with thick glasses, and a sign that read, Estate Sales, all original, no reproductions. The typewriter was sitting on a wooden crate, dusty and worn, its keys yellowed with age, but when Grace touched the carriage, it moved with face, with physical people, and if it please step in on a news in outlist laid in the domentry of found that clued the buddy gain. Something it is like this tone. Have a harky? Infexily. No anymore, Grace said. But I know someone who needs to find her voice again. The man nodded like that made perfect sense, and Grace handed him the crumpled bills she had been saving for emergencies. She carried the typewriter back to Astoria on the subway, holding it on her lap like something fragile, and she spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning it. She polished the keys, she oiled the carriage, she found a roll of ribbon at a stationery store and threaded it through with steady hands, then pressed a key just to hear the sound. Ding. The sound filled her tiny apartment like a bell, and she smiled. She wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with twine, the way her mother used to wrap birthday presents. And she wrote a card that she slipped under the twine. She did not sign it. She did not need to. On Monday morning, she carried the package into the office and set it on Vivienne's desk, between the stack of board reports and the framed photo of the Manhattan skyline that had been there since Grace's first week. She did not announce it. She did not explain it. She just set it down, and she went to her own office, and she waited. She did not have to wait long. The door to Vivienne's office opened at 4:47 that afternoon. Vivienne stood in the doorway, the brown paper already peeled back, the typewriter cradled in her arms like something infinitely precious. Her eyes were red, her mascara was smudged, which Grace had never seen before, not once. Not even during the boardroom crisis or the night Grace had turned down her watching Casablanca at 3 a.m.
"Grace," Vivienne said. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. Grace looked up from her computer, heart hammering. "It's not new," she said, because she didn't know what else to say. "It's from the 70s, I think. The man at the flea market said it belonged to a poet who used to live in Park Slope. I cleaned it up. I got new ribbon, I tested it. It still works." Vivienne took a step forward, then another. She set the typewriter down on Grace's desk, and she looked at it for a long moment. And then she did something Grace had never seen her do before. She sat down in the chair across from Grace's desk, and she started to cry. Not the kind of crying that is polite and contained, the kind that happens at funerals and sad movies. This was the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it has no name. The kind of crying that sounds like a wound finally being allowed to drain. Grace did not move. She did not reach for Vivienne. She did not say a word. She just sat there, present and still. The way you stay in a room with someone who is finally, blessedly coming apart because you know that the worst thing you can do is leave them alone with the pieces. "I used to listen to my mother type at night," Vivienne said, her voice thick. "I would lie in bed and count the dings, one for each line. I thought it meant she was writing to me. I thought the letters were for me." She laughed, a broken sound. "They were for her lawyer. She was writing to her lawyer about the divorce. She was planning her escape while I lay in bed counting her lies." Grace felt her own eyes sting. She did not wipe them. She let the tears come. "When she left, I threw away everything she had ever touched," Vivienne said. "I burned the letters. I sold the furnicle. Think my father donated the piano. I thought if I could get rid of everything she had ever loved, I could get rid of the part of me that still loved her." She looked down at the typewriter in her lap. "But I never could get rid of the sound. I hear it in my head every time I close my eyes. The dings, the rhythm, the sound of someone writing their way out of my life." Grace reached across the desk and placed her hand over Vivienne's. "This one is yours now," she said softly. "No one wrote their way out of anyone on this one. A poet in Park Slope used it to write about flowers, and her grandmother, and the way the light hits the bridge at sunset. And if you want, you can use it to write new letters. To yourself, to me, to the girl who was counting dings and didn't know she was being left." Vivienne looked at her, and the gray of her eyes was softer than Grace had ever seen it, the winter storm finally giving way to a pale spring light. "I don't know how to write that letter," Vivienne whispered. "Then don't," Grace said. "Just type the first line. I'll be here to read the rest." The office was quiet, except for the hum of the building and the distant sound of traffic far below. Vivienne set the typewriter on Grace's desk and with trembling hands rolled a blank sheet of paper into the carriage. She looked at Grace and Grace nodded, and then Vivienne began to type, one key at a time, the sound of the old Remington filling the room like a bell calling people home. Ding. Grace watched the words appear on the page, one by one, and she smiled through her tears. The letter said, "Dear Grace, I don't know how to start, but I'm not leaving." Grace reached over and pressed her hand to Vivienne's, guiding her fingers to the keys. The two of them sat there side by side as the sun set over Manhattan, writing a new story on an old machine, one key at a time. Ding. Later. I often thought that love in real life rarely has a perfect beginning. It might start with a spilled cup of coffee, accompanied by endless testing, defensiveness, and embarrassing moments of mishaps. But true romance is never about never making mistakes. It's about having all your vulnerabilities and scars completely seen through, and still having that person willing to sit beside you and firmly say, "I won't leave."